Welcome, Wargamers, to the Architecture of Domains and the Elemental Expeditions. Today, we are continuing our discussion about the Sorcerer Kings in the game of Conquest, the last argument of Kings, and they are, if I'm not mistaken, the most recent faction, although there's a new one, number 9, coming up real quick at Adepticon this year, but Sorcerer Kings are the new hotness. And as I was writing the script for my previous video on the elemental courts, kind of the wizard structure of things, I had mentioned towards the end of that video that I kind of wish there was a little bit more info about the kind of mechanics, the nature of what it's like to go into one of these elemental domains. One of the 4 pillars of the primordial god balance, it's basically the hell dimension that these guys pull their magics from. That's my layman's terms. And in between writing that script and producing the video for it, Bellum apparently heard my plea and dropped an article on their website called The Architecture of Domains and Elemental Expeditions. Now this is a really interesting one. I love the Bellum lore side of things from their website because it's such a great mix of map knowledge, historical information, and then there's stuff like this where you have a quote by a prominent figure of the faction. We have a quote by Aetheric, who moves the oceans. And then it kind of goes into a dissertation, but the tone of it is almost like somebody in the world trying to explain it to you, like a professor or something like that. So it becomes very fun to just kind of read through and kind of piece together their interpretation of what they're looking at. And so in this video, I'm just going to literally read this article because I found it so interesting and I would love to share it with you. We have here at the start an insert from the Introduction of Poetry of Currents by Aetheric, who moves the oceans. I never, quote, discovered, unquote, I was gifted. I just realized everybody else wasn't. Imagine, if you would, that you have always lived your life submerged up to just below eye level in the water of a giant mirror lake. Now and then, not always, but now and then, something will disturb the lake and a wave will cover your eyes. Be brave enough to keep them open and you will glimpse under the surface. I remember a fellow student who once said something similar. He said it felt that he had been assigned to side seats in the theater, and now and then he would see the actors waiting for their cue before they take center stage. It was, for him, part of the experience, that knowledge of the existence of backstage, that understanding that the play the rest are watching is but the surface of the sea, the facade of forces long and hard at work beyond our sight. All magic was, at the time, was reaching into the depths, piercing the surface willingly and with purpose, rather than randomly. Then stir the water, just so, to make the wave you wanted. I suppose for my friend, it was like prompting the actors, knowing they are such. I want to pause there real quick. I love that quote because it's a fantastic way of illustrating your perception, right? If perception is reality, there's a certain number of people that just get a glimpse into what we'll say is backstage of reality. The schooling, the discipline, all that kind of stuff of the Sorcerer Kings is built upon people being able to see backstage and then all being like, how do we understand this? I like the illustration of you're in the water up to your eyeballs and sometimes your eyes go underwater and you can see that second world. That's great imagery as well. It's very physical in the sense of being submerged in something, but the actor one is what really got me. The reality behind the facade. Proceeding into the rest of the article. While all gifted have a very vague and only instinctual understanding of the architecture of the cosmos, few can claim more comprehensive or more first-hand knowledge about the subject than the Sorcerer Kings. This, however, did not happen overnight. Even the 4 sorcerer deities stumbled and wandered in their explorations in their quest for understanding the domains. Like pioneers sailing into uncharted seas to discover untouched lands, so did the 4 god kings, their apprentices, and their followers brave the unknown of entirely different worlds, learning and understanding like few before their structure, connections, and influences. It is perhaps appropriate, when one tries to learn about such things, to follow these hallowed steps of the giants that came before. They have, in fact, dedicated centuries and entire generations of sorceress apprentices to the task. To begin our understanding, it would be prudent to begin with what is known before and what is largely understood by most students of magic. In this primordial rule of balance, its greatest manifestation, the very image of balance, is the world as we know it, the material world. Also known as the prime domain amongst Sorcerer Kings, Ecumeni, meaning the inhabitable among scholars of the city-states, the Midgard or the middle world according to the Nords, the world apparent according to most chapters in the 100 Kingdoms, the Bregurtu in the Dweghom, meaning the world that can break, or Nenea, for the Wadrun, which is an interesting word, a loaned term from a lost civilization that predated the Old Dominion. The material world has been named many things, all of which implies one singular thing. There are other worlds beyond it. It is obvious that magic practitioners have ever understood this truth, and it's not hard to see why. Since magic stems from a spiritual sort of soul imbalance, those gifted with magic, and therefore such an imbalance, are almost not fully attuned to the material. They almost by default live from a position that allows them to, quote, glimpse behind the curtain, end quote, as it were, to see beyond the border of the material world and whatever else is out there. But that experience alone has taught gifted three things, not just one. The first, the material world is not the whole world, but only a state of existence, one domain. 2, if the material is but one, there must be at least one other such state or domain. And 3, for the domains to exist in parallel without touching, there must be a border between the two. It is well established that attempts to enter other domains have walked hand in hand with the theoretical knowledge of their existence. In many ways, no one was really interested in proving the domains existed. Most mages focused on the task already knew they existed, as mentally reaching into them was in fact part of working with magic. But what mages were super interested in was visiting the domains. For if mentally reaching into them offered the power of spells and magic, that's essentially what they're doing, is they're kind of casting their mind into this domain and pulling out skill sets. Well, if you could do that with your brain, what would physical visitation endow? To achieve this, the scholars of magic, primarily during the Old Dominion, attempted time and time again to study the border, meaning that thin veil that separated the prime from the rest of the domains, or domain. Known as the Mantle, the term for that border is almost as old as magic itself. But success came relatively early, or so did the scholars of the Old Dominion once believe, in two ways. Firstly, the Mantle was crossed and mages could, for the first time, enter a new world. But not one that they had expected or hoped for. Rather than the elemental powerhouses their mind had envisioned, they entered a bleak domain, muted in its topology and experience. Naming it the Shroud, it was as exciting to reach as it was uninteresting to explore, considering what they were after. What was interesting was that the existence of more domains could be safely concluded as a certainty from inside the Shroud. And this brought the second success: connecting items to elemental forces, making them a medium between these elemental domains. But reaching the domains themselves physically proved impossible, and the same techniques and spells that had pierced the Mantle in the first place proved counterproductive within the Shroud, spitting the mages back into Prime instead. Traversing the Mantle to enter the Shroud was a giant first step into the exploration of the domains, but the true nature of this Shroud would become apparent much later. It took the studies of anathematics, and therefore the practices of his 4 apprentices, to understand that, metaphysically speaking, a thin border which shields and filters the influences of the other domains on the material world is anything but. The anathematic first realized that the Mantle and the Shroud were, in fact, the same thing. The first domain his predecessors had successfully visited was nothing but the very border that they were trying to pierce. Their incantations to pierce it further did nothing of the sort, because from their inception, they were transportive, bringing them in and out of the Mantle. If you wanted to reach the domains, you had to go further and perform much, much better. It is unclear what the anathematic did. I'm going to pause here as a person reading this. If you don't know who that is, it's a very important character for the city-states lore. It occurred to me they never put any kind of introduction here. Go listen to my video series on that for who this character is. But it's essentially the brightest mind of mankind understanding the ethereal. Okay, back to the story. It's unclear what the anathematic did, what paths he traversed before he disappeared, even to his 4 greatest students. To them, it was obvious that the two things he did leave behind for them to find were immensely powerful and dangerously so. One was the ritual to kill a god. The other was the means to achieve the power to cast that ritual, a direct route to the very essence of each elemental domain, their metaphysical cores, as well as the means to bind one's soul to them. And yet, as they readily embraced those teachings, the four sorcerers that brought down a god knew that his true research and accomplishments remained a mystery. As dreaded as it is coveted to this day, his research eludes them. For what he left behind were only partial, tested, and safe techniques, cautioning against others of truly trying to pierce the mantle. Despite their eagerness to test their master's teachings, the four never challenged the wisdom of not breaking a dimension, much more one that shields the prime domain. Instead, to enter the elemental domains, mind and body had to be prepared, and one should rely on enhancing, ridiculously so, an element's influence on one's mind and on the prime domain, stretching the mantle's filters without tearing it. This, within the shroud, manifested as a window into the domain itself. The four Sorcerer Kings now each had a whole domain to explore and master, bound to its deepest, most powerful expressions. But before they did that, like dutiful students, they had to first mitigate the damage. For the fall, Nunua's sacrifice, their own ritual and the raising of a continent that had wreaked havoc on Prime, the Mantle, and the elemental domains themselves. For centuries, therefore, the four simply dove time and time again into their respective domains, coordinating to undo the cosmological damage they had a part in causing, second only to the breaking by the Dweggle. But minds such as theirs do not abandon the quest for knowledge even amidst duty. With an entire civilization budding around them and focused on their needs, they soon realized that they did not need to explore their domains in person. They needed explorers in their name. Soon, a race of exploration began, with each court attempting to visit and understand their element's domain. The elemental expeditions were neither rushed nor careless. One does not reach the heights of magical mastery of the four god kings without properly understanding and respecting the dangers of their craft. Their students were held to the same standards of prudence and meticulousness. For a century, therefore, the sorcerers of the elemental courts carefully and diligently prepared an entire generation of candidates, creating schools and orders that concentrated on the exploration of the domains. First, students were expected to learn how to mentally visit the domains, controlling their journey and presence there. This method, too hectic and nebulous with techniques known at the time, proved unreliable. Each sorcerer claimed the experience of the domain could differ from visit to visit, with the element feeling sometimes more intense than others. Each time, the domain seemed to mirror the material, albeit distorted, of course, and with the element of the domain having exaggerated the presence. More than that, early explorers reported almost face-like or animalistic manifestations within the elements, which seemed to resemble life, which was an absurdity by all accounts at the time. At first, they were believed to be unintended influence on the domain by the mental traveler, or maybe even other gifted or semi-gifted individuals. Nevertheless, they became something of a terror turned urban legend for those early interdimensional pioneers. But the true dangers were not hiding within those harmless shapes in the clouds, as one initiate called them. The true danger came when the physical exploration began. And despite such unreliable and puzzling accounts, these mental expeditions were paramount in opening the pathways to achieve this. True terror came when members of the first small group that was expected to physically enter a domain together ended up separated and unable to contact each other. This first such incident put a halt on all expeditions, as some expedition members were never recovered. By all accounts, all of them should have entered the same location, as much as you can have one, in the domain, using the exact same method and the same from location in the material. The teachings of their god kings offered no explanation to this, and neither did the accounts from the mental expeditions. While each explorer had shared that their experience of the domain may differ, They had never suspected that they had been entering the domain in different, perhaps random locations. It took different theories, and some more brave volunteers for the truth to be eventually uncovered. The early pioneers had neither concealed nor misinformed their pupils. They had simply missed the simple fact in their early explorations, for mentally, one can travel alone. Thus, while they all agreed in their experience that sometimes the domains seemed more intense than others, they had failed to realize that this was happening at the same time, and it was not the location of the domains that was different, it was in fact them. Depending on one's mental, physical, and magical readiness, their capacity, endurance, the same location in any domain could exist in different states at the same time, presenting different properties, changing in the landscape, and even different intensity of the elemental spirit's presence. Each of these states, named layers, seem to exist almost as distant from each other as the domains are from the material world. The same domain existed in several different states. The same domain was not a new world. It was at this point that the sorcerers understood why their gods had need of them. Each elemental domain was not a world to be explored, it was multiple. This discovery was almost as terrifyingly exciting as discovering the existence of an explosion of elemental flora and fauna in the upper layers of each domain. These discoveries became an obsession of the Sorcerer King elite. It's not hard to understand how and why their tribal population would distance themselves as they did. Their former masters simply did not care about this world enough. The entire economy of the continent revolved around these elemental expeditions, with those focused on the vertical exploration of the layers proving increasingly costly in resources and manpower. But the astounding discoveries each layer has put a dent into vertical exploration, as it became apparent early that horizontal exploration of each layer should be ensured as well. Filled to the brim with elemental beings waiting to be bound by powerful sorcerers and initiates alike, establishing footholds in each layer became paramount and extremely beneficial. People believe that the first colonies of the Sorcerer Kings are the two on the shores of Electra, but this is wrong. Entire generations of pioneers have been populating the different layers of the elemental domains, and to this day, they venture deeper still, discovering more about the way the entire cosmos works. Okay, friends, that was a long story, but I'm going to say this. It answers a lot of the questions that I had regarding the Sorcerer King, so I'm going to kind of just move briefly into the why is this cool. For starters, it answers the question that I had at the end of my last video, which is, what is the divide between the 4 Sorcerer Kings and everybody else? I had posited the question that, if they founded everything, how come none of their subordinates or generations after has met their knowledge? Well, it's because this already existing, almost deity intelligence level character, the Animethica, how it's called? Anathematic, there we go, apologies, gave them the information. They didn't earn it themselves. They're trying to figure out, okay, so we got the knowledge to do the thing, and now they have to stay relentlessly busy keeping everything together, fixing the world that they broke, and everybody else's job is to almost reverse engineer this knowledge, which is fantastic. Now, it got a little wordy there, and so my understanding, to kind of give a brief synopsis, is they kept trying to pierce the veil, and they created their own barrier, and they realized, crap, we're going into the barrier, not into this other universe. When they figured that out, they were able to bind their souls to the different domains and explore them. Each domain is a series of levels, like in a building, and the higher you go, the more crazy and powerful or whatever things get, and it's based upon the perception of the viewer. So as you get stronger in magic and stuff, you'll just see different things. And within these worlds, as you go higher, there's flora, fauna, monsters of all different kinds, spirits that you can bind. Initially, on the lower levels, it looks like they're just faces in the mist, and then they take more form as you go higher. The idea of these elemental expeditions sounds fantastic. These early pioneers of trying to understand this knowledge, but instead of climbing to the top of Everest or something like that, they're delving deep into a hell dimension. The idea that that is the first place that they colonized is actually very interesting to me. So the Sorcerer Kings have shown up in the story recently, kind of the grand narrative, with trying to establish outposts on Electria, which they mentioned at the end there. And that's rad, but the idea of being like, well, we're just going to stay where we are and we can just learn what we need from other dimensions is pretty sweet. It almost makes the rest of the continent seem a little unnecessary, but it's not true. This does a good job of answering the questions that I had. I mean, like, I would love to see some stuff of like a described from the perspective of a viewer. What's happening when someone walks in? Like, is they opening a portal or a rift? Do they just blink out like when Frodo puts on the ring? That kind of stuff I'd like to know. But the mechanics of what we're diving into and kind of following along with their progress, I thought was very interesting, and I thought it was well written. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you are a Sorcerer King player, what did you think of this article? I will leave a link directly to it, but there's no like special art or anything. It's literally just what I read to you. I would love to hear your thoughts down below. And hey, if you're going to grab anything by Conquest, please consider using my affiliate link in the link tree down below. It supports my family and means the absolute world to me. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you all next time. Happy Wargaming.